Canadians have major problems with access to effective new cancer drugs. Health Canada may approve the drug, but there may be no public funding for it. By that I mean that the provincial governments may not pay for it. For new cancer drugs, public funding in Canada occurs on average 3.7 years after public funding in the United States, and not until 2.9 years after initial public funding in Europe, if it happens at all. For some drugs, a patient might pay out of pocket, but it can cost more than $10,000 per month for some of these drugs, and many patients cannot afford this. So for most patients, public funding is essential if they are going to have access. My name is Dr. David Stewart. I'm a medical oncologist in Ottawa, Canada, and a professor of medicine at the University of Ottawa. And I recently wrote a book on cancer called A Short Primer on Why Cancer Still Sucks that can be purchased online through Amazon Books if you're interested. And it discusses this and several other topics on cancer. So why does Canada do so poorly in public funding of new anti-cancer drugs? And the answer is that it has been stated that every system is perfectly designed to get exactly the results it gets. And the Canadian system is specifically designed to give poor access. The reason that this poor access is so important is that many of these new drugs can meaningfully prolong life expectancy and alleviate suffering of patients with cancer. The research world has done a good job in developing new cancer drugs that can help patients with advanced cancers, but Canada has done a relatively poor job of providing these for its citizens. I've been asked by some people whether a drug company is paying me to say any of the things that I'm saying about access to new drugs. The answer is unequivocally no. 98% of my income on average annually comes from patient care paid by the government. On average, about 1.3% of my annual income comes from honoraria paid by drug companies. If they ask my advice, I may give it to them, but I may charge them for it. And that averages about 1.3% of my annual income. The reason I give this advice to companies is I hope that it might help them do a better job of giving effective treatments, developing effective treatments for my patients. They have not paid me for any of the many academic articles I've published on access to care, or for my book, or for any of these videos, and I do not own any stock in any pharmaceutical company. I've written these articles and done these videos in the hope that this may help my patients get better access to the treatments that they need. I find it very distressing when I see a patient that could benefit a lot from a new drug, but they cannot get access to it because they live in Canada instead of living in the United States or the UK or Germany or France or one of those other countries that do a much better job of providing these drugs for their citizens. Patients should not suffer and should not die prematurely simply because they live in Canada, but this is happening. This is one of the reasons that Canada is an international leader in medical assistance in dying, or MAID. We do a very efficient job of euthanizing our citizens if they're suffering, but a very poor job at providing them with effective new drugs that could help them. Several issues impact public funding of effective new drugs in Canada. The first step in access to a new drug is for a company to apply to Health Canada to be able to sell their drug in Canada. There's a lot of very expensive, detailed paperwork involved with this, and Health Canada charges them about $500,000 for the application. Canada has a population of 40 million people. When the company applies to the FDA in the United States, the FDA charges them $3.2 million, so far more than Canada charges them. But the United States has a population that's 8.5 times larger than Canada's population, and on average, Americans pay 3 times as much for drugs as Canadians do. Hence, economic forces dictate that most companies will use their resources to apply for marketing or approval in the United States long before they'll apply for approval in Canada. Most companies then apply to the European Medicines Agency, or EMA. So this gets approval for 450 million people, so 11 times as many people as Canada. And the EMA charges companies less than Canada charges them. And some European countries are willing to pay relatively high prices for these drugs. So it makes economic sense for companies to apply for marketing their drug in Europe before they apply in Canada. Once a company applies to Health Canada does a reasonably good job of reviewing the application. But because the companies apply to Canada long after they apply to the United States and Europe, that means that the drug gets initial regulatory approval in Canada substantially later than in many other countries. However, it is the steps that occur after Health Canada approval that are particularly problematic in Canada. Once Health Canada approves a drug, then it's passed on to the Canadian Drug Agency, or CDA, to do what's called a health technology assessment on the drug. Health Canada has already determined that the drug is both safe and effective, but the CDA then undertakes another evaluation of efficacy, and this is where the big problems start. The FDA, the EMA, and Health Canada all use different endpoints to determine whether or not a drug is effective. For example, they will all agree that the drug is effective if there's a significant prolongation of overall survival. But for several reasons, there may be insufficient information available on the drug's impact on overall survival, or the available data may be unreliable. But there will be other ways that we can evaluate effectiveness. For example, the drug may cause major tumor shrinkage in many patients, or it may significantly delay the time until the cancer begins to grow. Major tumor shrinkage is referred to as an objective response, and the time taken until the cancer begins to grow is called progression-free survival. These may give a much more reliable indicator of the drug's benefit than overall survival if the way that the overall survival is assessed is problematic or unreliable. In my next video, I will actually discuss why overall survival is quite frequently an unreliable indicator, and why response and progression-free survival in many cases may be a more reliable indicator of why a drug is beneficial. Because response or gain in progression-free survival may be a more reliable indicator of drug benefit than a flawed assessment of overall survival, each of the FDA, the EMA, and Health Canada may use these to approve a drug and to determine that the drug truly is beneficial if the assessment of overall survival is unreliable. However, in many cases, CDA, or the Canadian Drug Agency, has not accepted response or progression-free survival as indicators of benefit, even though at the FDA, the EMA, and Health Canada, and many other countries do agree that these are reliable indicators of drug benefit. The CDA may say that they will wait on information on overall survival before they approve the drug. That additional information may not become available for 2 or 3 years or more, if it ever becomes available at all. And during this time period, Canadians are denied public access or public funding for effective new drugs, while these drugs are available to patients in other countries. Or again, for reasons that we'll discuss in the next video, there may be information available on overall survival, but it may be obviously unreliable for a variety of reasons that I will discuss in the next video. So people like the FDA, the EMA, and Health Canada recognize that it's unreliable, and they take that into consideration, but the CDA may not. The CDA may instead decide that the drug is not effective and may then deny patients access to it because of a flawed interpretation of flawed data. The next issue is that if the CDA does decide that the drug is of value and should be made available, then it calculates the value of the drug based on a metric called QALYs, or quality adjusted life years. The calculation of the quality is based on both the prolongation of life expectancy and also changes in a patient's quality of life with the treatment. However, the estimate in gain in overall survival is often inaccurate. Assessments of changes in quality of life are also very imprecise and often inaccurate. Hence, the estimate of the number of qualities gained with an effective new drug is often misleading and unreliable. The next issue is with the value that the CDA assigns to a quality gained. They say that for every year of survival gained with a new drug, that Canada should pay no more than $50,000 per year. So spending $50,000 a year for a drug may sound like a lot, but $50,000 per year was also what we were willing to pay back in 1980, when a dollar was worth 4 times more than it is now. And until recent years, Canada was willing to pay $200,000 or more per year of life gained. And Canada has been willing to pay far more than that per year of life gained by a variety of other interventions. So CDA is telling us that the life of a Canadian cancer patient is now worth substantially less than what it used to be worth, and is also worth substantially less than Canadians in other situations. They have not told us why they think this. The CDA then takes their highly flawed calculation of equality and applies their evaluation to it. And then they'll tell a company that the company must cut the price by up to 90% compared to what they can get in other parts of the world if they're going to sell it to Canada. So overall, I have several concerns on how CDA decides on the value of a new drug. I'm also concerned with how long it takes for the CDA to do their assessment. On average, it takes them 7 months. They think this is very short, but I do not share their perspective. Over the 7 months while they're doing their analysis, hundreds or thousands of Canadians are suffering and dying because they cannot get access to the new drug. In addition, all the data that the CDA needs for their calculations are already available at the time of the Health Canada assessment. Personally, I think it would only take about 15 minutes to do the calculation. They will say it's far more complicated than that, but I do not share their perspective on this. I've offered to discuss this with the CDA, but they do not appear to be interested in discussing it with me. In addition, I even applied for a position on one of their advisory committees so I could get more insight into why they think the way they did, but they declined my application. If the CDA does decide that the drug is of some value and that Canada should consider buying it at a deeply discounted price, then they pass it on to another body called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, or the PCPA. Both the CDA and the PCPA are controlled by the provincial and federal governments together. So one cannot blame a single political party or a level of government for the mess we're in access to new drugs. All the different levels of government and the different political parties have done this together. It can take months after the CDA makes a decision that the drug might be worthwhile before the PCPA even begins to consider it. If the PCPA does decide to negotiate, then they will approach the company and they will tell them that they want a discount. They want the price to be cut by up to 90%. So some companies don't even bother to apply in Canada, or else they will walk away from the table when they get this demand for these deep discounts. Just put it in perspective. If you had your house in the market and the government came up and told you that they would pay you 1/10 of your asking price, 1/10 of what somebody else has already offered you, you would not be very impressed with them, I don't think. For those companies that do decide to negotiate, then it will often take months to come to an agreement on a price. But that's not the end of it. Then it goes on to each of the provinces to do additional negotiations. This takes additional time, and that's why the public funding for new effective new cancer drugs in Canada does not occur until an average of about 2 years after Health Canada approval, and again 2 or 3 or 4 years after public funding in Europe and the United States. And that's if public funding becomes available at all. So it may not just be delayed, but Canada at the end of the day may not get access at all. And all this time, there are patients that are suffering and dying who could have benefited from these drugs. In the past, if a Canadian had a good health insurance paid for by their employer, that insurance company might pay for the drug for them, even though the government did not. But increasingly, insurance companies are now refusing to pay for drugs if the government does not pay for them. So Canadians are stuck. In many cases, Canadians have very poor or no access to effective new drugs. There's another uniquely Canadian aspect to this, impacting this, and that's another body called the Patented Medicines Price Review Board, or PMPRB. For patented medicines, the PMPRB monitors drug prices and then may go to the company and demand a further deep discount in the price. So a company has spent all the time negotiating with the PCPA and the provinces to get their drug, to sell their drug at a deeply discounted price, and then the PMPRB comes in and demands a further reduction in the price of the drug. The prospect of this happening has led to a substantial decrease in the number of companies that are even interested in applying to Canada to sell their drugs. Overall, it should be no surprise that Canadians have such poor access to effective new drugs. Our system has been perfectly designed to guarantee that we have poor access. Now, the people that work at the CDA and PCPA and PMPRB, these are good people. They're trying to do the right thing, but they are following the dictates of the governments that have put them in place, that have told them they must bring down the price of these drugs. They cannot unilaterally fix this. The only way to fix this is if the politicians decide to fix it. It has to be all political parties and all levels of government, or both provincial and federal government, working together to fix this mess. New drugs are very expensive. I get that. But it's no accident that they are so expensive. Just like our public funding approaches are perfectly designed to give us poor access, international clinical research regulation is perfectly designed to give us incredibly high drug prices. In my earlier videos and in my book, A Short Primer on Why Cancer Still Sucks, through Amazon Books, I discussed why drug prices are so high and what we need to do to solve this. It's just a matter of making it a priority and then doing the things that need to be done. But rather than tackling the problem, we rather just complain and try to treat the symptom, the very high drug prices, rather than treating the underlying cause. We will not solve this unless we deal with the underlying cause. If you agree with me that your loved one should not suffer and die prematurely, that they should have at least as good access to effective new drugs as they do to MAID, and that they should have at least as good access to effective new drugs as citizens in other countries, then contact the members of all the political parties and both the provincial and federal levels of government. They together have created this mess. They must fix it. And they might say this is too complicated to fix, but it's not. All we have to do is make it a priority. If we make it a priority, we can fix it.